The day we buried my mother, the sky seemed to share in my sorrow. Heavy, gray clouds loomed above us, as if the universe itself were mourning her loss. My name is Lucy, and that day, as I walked towards St. Isidore Cemetery in Madrid, I felt each step dragging me deeper into a reality I refused to accept. The cemetery, with its tall cypress trees and pristine white marble headstones, had always seemed a peaceful place to me. But that day, every corner screamed of Mom's absence. I had seen her for the last time at La Paz Hospital, where she had worked as a nurse for over 30 years. Even in her final days, her smile lit up the room, comforting everyone who visited her. Now that light was gone, and I felt utterly lost in darkness. Father Alexander from St. Mary the White Parish led the service. His deep, resonant voice filled the damp air as he spoke of my mother's kindness, her dedication to others, and how her faith had guided her throughout her life. I listened, yet every word struck me like a dagger in my heart. How could I possibly go on without her? Mom wasn't just my mother, she was my best friend, my confidant, the one who always knew exactly how to make me feel better. I looked around. There were her colleagues from the hospital, a few patients who remembered her fondly, and, of course, my in-laws. My husband, James, stood beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder in a gesture that should have been comforting, but it felt distant, almost forced. And then there was her, my mother-in-law, Caroline, impeccably dressed in black, her cold gaze appraising the situation rather than sharing in my grief. When the casket began to lower into the ground, I felt a part of me descend with it. The tears I had held back throughout the service finally overflowed. I let out a muffled sob, and then I felt someone embrace me. For a moment, I thought it was James, but when I opened my eyes, I saw it was Mary, my lifelong neighbor. "Your mother would be proud of you, Lucy," she whispered in my ear. "You're as strong as she was." After the burial, as was tradition, we all headed home. Mom's house, my childhood home in the Chimberry neighborhood, now felt strangely empty. The familiar scent of cinnamon that always filled the kitchen had vanished, replaced by the fragrance of funeral wreaths. As people entered, murmuring condolences and filling the space with hushed conversations, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I retreated to the kitchen, seeking a moment of solitude. I made some coffee, a habitual act that reminded me of all the mornings I had shared with Mom in that very spot. It was then that Caroline entered, her presence filling the small space in a way that made me uneasy. "Lucy," she said, her voice as firm and cold as steel. "We need to talk about the house." I blinked, confused. "The house? At this moment?" Before I could respond, she continued, "From now on, this house is mine. No one is allowed to stay here." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. What was she talking about? This was my mother's house, my home. I had grown up here. Every corner held a cherished memory, the growth marks on the kitchen door frame, the notches in the wooden floor where I once played with my dolls, the old armchair where Mom read me bedtime stories. All of that was a part of me, part of my history. "Caroline," I managed to say, my voice trembling with disbelief and mounting anger. "I don't understand. This is my mother's house. I'm her only daughter. How can you claim it as yours?" But Caroline remained unmoved. With a swift motion, she reached for the keychain hanging by the door and snatched the keys to Mom's car. Holding them up like a trophy, she declared, "This is mine now too. It's for everyone's best interest, Lucy. You wouldn't know what to do with all this." I felt the air leave me. How could this be happening? On the day of my mother's funeral? I searched for James. I needed him to stand up to his mother. But when our eyes met, I saw something that chilled me, resignation, as if he already knew this would happen. "James," I called, my voice barely a whisper. "Say something, please." But he only lowered his gaze, murmuring something unintelligible before leaving the kitchen. I stood there, paralyzed, watching as Caroline began opening drawers and cabinets, inspecting every item as if taking inventory. "You can't do this," I finally said, finding my voice. "You have no right." Caroline paused for a moment, looking at me with a mix of pity and disdain. "Oh, dear," she said, her voice sweet yet laced with venom. I've already done it. And I suggest you don't cause any trouble. After all, who do you have left? Who will help you if it isn't us, your family? Her words struck me hard. It was true. Who was left for me? My grandparents had passed away years ago. I had no siblings and friends. Well, friends have their own lives. For a moment, I felt utterly alone and vulnerable. Then, like a distant whisper, I heard my mother's voice in my mind. Lucy, my darling, you are stronger than you think. Never let anyone make you feel small. Those words, repeated countless times when I faced challenges at school or work, echoed within me, lending me strength. I took a deep breath and looked directly into Caroline's eyes. This isn't over, I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. This is my home, my mother's home, and I won't let you take it away from me. Caroline raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by my sudden challenge. For a moment, I saw a flash of doubt in her eyes, but she quickly composed herself. We'll see, she replied, before striding out of the kitchen. I stood there, my hands trembling, but with a newfound resolve in my heart. I didn't know how, but I was going to fight for my mother, for our memories, for everything this house represented. And as the murmurs of the funeral guests filled the home, I made a silent promise. Mom, I won't let your legacy fade away. I promise you that. The days following the funeral felt like living in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. The house that once echoed with laughter and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee now resembled a silent battleground. Every corner held the lingering shadow of an argument with Caroline. Every object had become a potential spark for conflict. James drifted through the house like a ghost, avoiding my gaze, dodging any attempt at a serious conversation. His silence was deafening, more painful than Caroline's cutting words. We had shared 10 years of marriage, building what I believed was a solid relationship. Now, when I needed him most, he had become a stranger. One morning, while preparing breakfast in the kitchen, a routine act more out of habit than hunger, I decided it was time to confront him. I couldn't continue living in this limbo, where unspoken words weighed heavier than any shout. James, I called as he entered, his eyes fixed on the floor as if searching for answers to unasked questions. We need to talk. He looked up, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the man I had fallen in love with, vulnerable, a little scared, yet present. But that glimpse vanished almost immediately, replaced by the mask of indifference he had come to wear so often. About what? He murmured. I took a deep breath, searching for the calm I needed. About everything, James. About your mother, about this house, about us. You can keep pretending that nothing's happening. James sank heavily into one of the kitchen chairs, the very chair where Mom used to enjoy her afternoon tea. Seeing him there, taking his place, sent a sharp pang through me that I tried to ignore. Lucy, he began in a tired voice, I know things are complicated, but my mother only wants what's best for everyone. His words ignited a spark of anger within me. What's best for everyone? How can taking away my mother's house, my memories, my inheritance, be the best? I demanded. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he often made when nervous. You don't understand. My mother, she has her reasons. Maybe we should listen to her, see what she suggests. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was this the same man who had promised me unconditional love and support? The one who had vowed always to stand by my side? Her reasons? I repeated incredulously. James, this is the house I grew up in, where I spent every Christmas, every birthday, and cared for Mom in her final days. How can you even suggest that I give up all that? I saw him struggle within, as if one part of him wanted to side with me, but another, stronger part kept him tethered to his mother's will. Lucy, dear, he finally said in a tone reminiscent of how one speaks to a child who doesn't understand. Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the good of the family. My mother has connections, influence. She can help secure a better future for us. His words hit me like a slap. And what about my family, James? My mother was my only family. This house is all I have left of her. How can you ask me to give that up? James stood up, approaching as if to embrace me, but I stepped away. His closeness, which once comforted me, now felt like a betrayal. Lucy, please, he pleaded. Just give my mother a chance. Listen to what she has to say. I'm sure we can reach an agreement that benefits everyone. At that moment, something inside me broke. The last hope I had of James supporting me, the partner he promised to be, vanished. An agreement? I said, my voice trembling with contained anger. Do you really think this is a negotiation? That I can simply trade away my mother's memories, my home? James recoiled, surprised by the intensity of my reaction. It's not what I meant, he stammered. Then what did you mean, James? I pressed. Because from where I stand, it looks like you're choosing to side with your mother over me. When I need you most, you're failing me. I saw the weight of my words settle on him. For a moment, it seemed he was about to speak, to defend himself, maybe even to join my side. But then, as so often in recent days, he simply lowered his head. I'm sorry, he murmured. I need to think. And with that, he left the kitchen, leaving me alone once more. I remained there, staring at the empty space he left behind, feeling the silence of the house envelop me. James's inability to stand up to his mother or support me was more painful than any words he could have spoken. In that moment, as tears streamed down my cheeks, I made a decision. I could no longer wait for James to find his voice, to take my side. If I was going to fight for what was mine, for my mother's legacy, I would have to do it alone. I left the kitchen and climbed the stairs to my mother's bedroom. There, in the drawer of her nightstand, she kept all the important documents, property titles, wills, bank papers. If I was going to confront Caroline, I needed every weapon I could get. As I sifted through the papers, my eyes fell on a framed photo on the wall. It was from my college graduation, Mom and I, smiling at the camera, filled with hope for the future. I remembered how she always urged me to be strong, to fight for what I believed in. I miss you so much, Mom, I whispered to the photograph. But I won't fail you. I won't let anyone take away what you built for us. With the documents clutched in my hand, I went back downstairs. I found James in the living room, slumped on the couch with a vacant look. For a moment, I felt sorry for him. He seemed so lost, torn between his loyalty to his mother and his love for me. But I could no longer afford to wait for him to find his way. James, I said firmly. He looked up, surprised by the resolve in my tone. I've made a decision. I'm going to fight for this house, for my mother's memory. If you're with me, great. If not, you'll have to decide which side you're on. I saw the conflict in his eyes, the internal struggle tearing him apart. But I couldn't wait any longer. With or without him, I was going to face whatever came. Because in his silence and indecision, I had discovered my own strength, and that strength, born of pain and loss, would guide me through the difficult days ahead. The late afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows over the wooden floor. The silence in the house was almost tangible, broken only by the ticking of the old wall clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from my parents. Each tick seemed to bring me closer to an inevitable breaking point. I was in the living room, poring over the documents I'd found in Mom's room for what felt like the 100th time, when I heard the front door open. The sound of high heels clicking on the marble foyer alerted me to Caroline's arrival. My heart began to race, a mix of fear and determination surging through my veins. Caroline strode into the living room as if she owned the place, her presence making me feel small as always. But today, I refused to shrink back. Lucy, she said in a greeting as cold as ice, I see you're still here. I thought you'd have understood by now that it's time for you to leave. I took a deep breath, steadying my trembling hands. I'm not going anywhere, Caroline. This is my house. I saw her eyes narrow, a flash of irritation crossing her perfectly made-up face. Don't be foolish, dear. We've already discussed this. This house now belongs to me. No, it doesn't belong to you, I retorted, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. I have the documents to prove it. Mom left everything to me. Caroline let out a dry laugh, devoid of humor. Documents? Do you really think some old papers can stop me? You have no idea who you're dealing with, Lucy. She stepped closer, her expensive perfume overwhelming my senses. For a moment, I felt like a little girl again, intimidated by her presence. But then I remembered Mom's words, her strength, her love. I wasn't going to let Caroline take that away. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, I replied, standing tall to face her. I'm dealing with someone who thinks she can take advantage of my pain, of my loss. But you're mistaken, Caroline, I won't allow it. I saw a flash of surprise in her eyes, quickly replaced by cold fury. You think you can stand up to me? To me? Naive girl. I have connections you can't even imagine. I can make your life a living hell with just one phone call. Her words were meant to scare me, to make me back down. And a part of me wanted to surrender to her force. But another part, echoing my mother's spirit, urged me to stand firm. Make your calls, Caroline, I said calmly, but I'm not leaving. This is my house, my mother's home, and I'm going to fight for it with everything I've got. Caroline stepped back, clearly surprised by my resistance. For a brief moment, I saw doubt flicker in her eyes, as if she were rethinking her strategy, but then her expression hardened once more. You don't know what you're doing, Lucy, she hissed in a low, threatening tone. You're playing with fire, and you're going to get burned. At that moment, I heard footsteps on the stairs. James appeared in the doorway, his face pale and tense. He looked from his mother to me, and I could see the inner conflict written across his face. What's going on here? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Caroline turned to him with a false smile. Nothing, dear. I was just explaining to Lucy that it's time for her to leave, that we need to start organizing the house. I felt a pang as I watched James lower his gaze, unwilling to confront the situation. But I could no longer rely on him. This was my battle. No, Caroline, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. What's happening here is that you're trying to steal my inheritance, my mother's house, my memories, everything I have left of her. James suddenly lifted his head, his eyes wide with surprise. What? Mom, what is Lucy talking about? Caroline snorted in frustration. Don't listen to her, James. She's confused by her grief. She doesn't know what she's saying. I'd had enough of her lies and manipulation. I pulled out the documents I'd been reviewing and held them high. These are the property papers for the house, I said, looking directly at James. My mother's will. Everything is in my name. Your mother is trying to take it all away. I saw understanding dawn on James's face, quickly followed by a mix of shame and horror. He turned to his mother, disbelief clear in his voice. Mom, is this true? Caroline's anger surged. Her voice dropped to a dangerous hiss. Don't be ridiculous, James. I'm doing this for us, for our future. This foolish girl doesn't know how to handle a property like this. But James no longer listened. He moved toward me, taking the documents with trembling hands. As he reviewed them, I saw the reality of the situation settle over him. Oh my God, Lucy, he murmured. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought. His words were cut off by the sound of something breaking. We turned to see Caroline, her face contorted in rage, clutching the shattered remains of a vase that had once adorned the fireplace mantel, a gift from my grandmother to my mother on her wedding day. Enough, Caroline shouted. I won't let a little brat ruin everything I've worked for. James, we're leaving. Now. But James didn't move. For the first time since Mom's passing, I saw determination in his eyes. No, Mom. We're not going anywhere. We've made a terrible mistake, and it's time to fix it. Caroline glared at him as if he had sprouted a second head. Do you dare defy me? You, your own mother. Yes, James replied firmly. Because it's the right thing to do. Because I love Lucy, and because I can't be part of this. The ensuing silence was deafening. Caroline stared at us, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. Finally, she spat bitterly. Fine. Keep your miserable house. But remember my words. This isn't over. You have no idea what I've set in motion. With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out. We heard the front door slam shut, its echo reverberating through the house. I collapsed onto the couch, my legs trembling from adrenaline. James sat beside me, gently taking my hands in his. Lucy, he began, his voice breaking with emotion, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me. I should have believed you. I should have supported you from the start. I looked at him, the man I had fallen in love with resurfacing before my eyes. I wanted to hug him, to tell him that everything would be all right. But the wound was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. "I need time, James," I whispered. "I need to process all of this." He nodded, regret and understanding evident in his eyes. "I understand. I'll be here when you're ready. And I promise that no matter what happens, I'll stand by your side." As the sun set, bathed in golden and reddish hues, I realized that this confrontation was only the beginning. Caroline wouldn't give up easily, and the days ahead would be arduous. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had found my voice, my strength. And with James finally by my side, perhaps we could overcome whatever came our way. The old clock in the hallway kept ticking, each tick reminding me that life goes on. And I was ready to face it, with my mother's memory guiding me and the determination burning in my heart. The silence following Caroline's tempestuous exit was almost palpable. James and I remained seated on the couch, our minds still reeling from the intensity of the confrontation. The ticking clock seemed louder than ever, as if counting down the seconds until our next challenge. Then we heard it, a dull noise coming from the front door. It wasn't someone knocking, it was the sound of someone trying to enter uninvited. James and I exchanged alarmed glances. "Were you expecting someone?" James whispered, slowly rising. I shook my head, my heart pounding faster. "No, no one," I replied softly and rose as well. The noise repeated, this time accompanied by the unmistakable sound of the door opening. Firm footsteps echoed through the foyer, approaching the room where we stood. Instinctively, James stepped in front of me, as if to shield me from what was coming. Two men appeared in the doorway. They were tall, with sturdy builds, dressed in dark suits that exuded authority. Their faces were stern and unyielding, and their eyes scanned the room with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. "Who are you?" James demanded, his voice firmer than he'd intended. "How dare you enter our home like this?" The taller of the two stepped forward. His presence filled the room in a way that uncomfortably reminded me of Caroline, yet there was something different about him. It wasn't arrogance that emanated from him, but a cold, calculated authority. "Good afternoon," he said in a deep, controlled voice. "I'm Inspector Robert Vega, and this is my partner, Sub-Inspector Michael Torres. We're here regarding an ongoing investigation." I felt the blood drain from my veins. An investigation? About what? My mind raced, replaying the events of recent weeks, searching for anything that might have triggered this. James seemed to recover from the shock. "Investigation? What are you talking about? You can't just barge into a private home without a warrant." Inspector Vega produced an envelope from his jacket and held it up. "We have a warrant, sir. And I suggest you cooperate with us. Things will go much more smoothly if you do." I stepped forward, standing beside James. "May I see that warrant, please?" I asked, surprised by the calm in my own voice. The inspector regarded me for a moment, as if assessing me, then extended the envelope. With trembling hands, I opened it and began to read. The words danced before my eyes, but I managed to grasp the essentials. They were investigating possible fraudulent activities related to my mother's property and assets. "This is ridiculous," I said, returning the envelope. My mother was a nurse. She lived an honest, hardworking life. There's nothing to investigate here. Sub-Inspector Torres, who had remained silent until now, spoke in a soft yet firm voice. "Ma'am, we understand that this is difficult, especially given your recent loss. But we've received information that we cannot ignore." James squeezed my hand in silent support. "What kind of information?" he asked. Inspector Vega pulled a folder from his briefcase and opened it. "We have records of several large bank transfers made from your mother's account in the last 2 years, along with suspicious property transfers, and, well, there are discrepancies in the wills that have caught our attention." I felt as if the ground were shifting beneath my feet. "Wills? In plural?" I only knew of one, the one my mother had left naming me as her sole heir. "What are these men talking about?" "This must be a mistake," I insisted, my voice trembling. "My mother only left one will. I have it right here." I walked to the desk where I'd left the documents after showing them to James. But when I opened the drawer, my heart stopped. The papers were gone. They weren't where I'd left them. Inspector Vega observed my confusion with interest. Is something wrong, ma'am? James approached me, concern etched on his face. Lucy, what's happening? The papers, I murmured, frantically rummaging through the drawer. They're gone. The will, the property documents, everything has disappeared. I saw the inspectors exchange a knowing glance. Sub-Inspector Torres pulled out a notepad and began taking notes. Interesting, remarked Inspector Vega. Very interesting. And you say these documents were here just a short while ago? I nodded, panic seizing me. They were here less than an hour ago. I used them to confront someone who was trying to take my house away. And who was that person? Asked Sub-Inspector Torres, his pencil hovering over his pad. I looked at James, seeking his support. He gave a slight nod, as if giving me permission to speak. My mother-in-law, I finally replied. Caroline Alvarez. She's been insisting that the house now belongs to her. The inspectors exchanged another glance. Inspector Vega closed the folder and cleared his throat. Ma'am, sir, I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to accompany us to the station for further questioning. What? Why? James exclaimed. We haven't done anything wrong. No one is saying that, sir, replied Inspector Vega calmly. But given the nature of our investigation and the sudden disappearance of crucial documents, we need to clarify a few things. I felt as if I were trapped in a nightmare. Just hours ago, I thought I'd won the battle for my mother's house. Now, suddenly, I found myself in the midst of a police investigation, with the documents proving my right to the property mysteriously gone. As the inspectors led us toward the door, I couldn't help but recall Caroline's parting words. This isn't over. You have no idea what I've set in motion. Was that what she meant? Had she orchestrated all of this? James wrapped an arm around me as we left, as if to shield me from whatever awaited us. But we both knew this was only the beginning. These mysterious officers had brought more questions than answers, and I had a feeling that unraveling this mystery would be even more difficult and painful than I could imagine. In the police car, the silence was tense. James and I sat in the back, our hands intertwined in a bid for comfort. The streets of Madrid blurred past the window, and I couldn't help but reflect on how, in just a few short hours, my life had taken such a dramatic turn. The police station was a gray, imposing building in the city center. As we climbed the steps at the entrance, it felt as if I were walking into the lion's den. Inspector Vega and Sub-Inspector Torres guided us through narrow hallways to a small interrogation room. The bare walls and the cold metal table did nothing to ease my nerves. Please have a seat, instructed Inspector Vega, gesturing to the chairs before the table. We'll try to make this as brief as possible. James and I sat down, our shoulders brushing lightly, each of us silently steeling ourselves. Sub-Inspector Torres set a recorder on the table and switched it on. For the record, we are here with Lucy Martinez and James Alvarez regarding case 2024 B3429. Date: December 23, 2024. Time: 7:45 p.m. Inspector Vega cleared his throat and began, Ma'am Martinez, could you tell us about your relationship with the late Elena Martinez? I swallowed hard, striving for composure. Elena was my mother. She passed away 3 weeks ago after a long illness. I was her only daughter. And did you live with her in the house on Serrano Street? He asked. I nodded. Yes, that has been our family home for as long as I can remember. My mother inherited it from my grandparents. Inspector Vega made a few notes. Ma'am Martinez, were you aware of your mother's financial activities during her final years? I frowned, confused. Financial activities? My mother was a retired nurse. She lived on her pension and some savings. She didn't have any major financial dealings, as far as I knew. The inspectors exchanged a look I couldn't decipher. Sub-Inspector Torres pulled out a folder and retrieved several documents. Ma'am Martinez, we have records of several large bank transfers from your mother's account over the last 2 years. Can you explain this? I felt as if I'd been punched in the stomach. That's impossible. My mother barely had enough for her medications. She couldn't have made such large transfers. Inspector Vega slid a bank statement toward me. It was in my mother's name. My eyes widened as I saw the figures, hundreds of thousands of euros moving in and out over recent months. I don't understand, I murmured, feeling as though my world were crumbling. This can't be right. James, who had remained silent until now, interjected. Excuse me, but where did you get this information? And what does it have to do with the house? Sub-Inspector Torres leaned forward. Mr. Alvarez, we received an anonymous tip that led us to investigate Elena Martinez's finances. In doing so, we uncovered several irregularities, including the existence of multiple wills. Multiple wills? I repeated in disbelief. But that's impossible. I only knew of one, the one my mother left me. Inspector Vega produced another document. This is a will dated 6 months ago, leaving all of Elena Martinez's property and assets to a certain Caroline Alvarez. Do you know her? I felt as though the air had been knocked out of me. She's my mother-in-law, I managed to say. She's been insisting the house belongs to her, but I have the original will naming me as the sole heir. The will that conveniently disappeared, commented Sub-Inspector Torres, his tone neutral but laden with implication. James stiffened beside me. This is madness. My mother, she wouldn't do something like that. There must be some mistake. Inspector Vega looked at us with an inscrutable expression. Mr. Alvarez, were you aware of any relationship between your mother and Elena Martinez beyond being in-laws? I saw James go pale. No, not that I knew of. They weren't particularly close. However, continued the inspector, we have records of numerous phone calls between them in recent months, as well as evidence of frequent meetings. My head spun. My mother and Caroline in constant contact? What was going on? There's something else, said Sub-Inspector Torres, pulling out another sheet. We have evidence that the house on Serrano Street was used as collateral for a substantial loan a few months ago, a loan that, according to our records, was applied for jointly by Elena Martinez and Caroline Alvarez. I felt as if the ground were opening beneath my feet. Everything I'd believed about my mother, about my life, was crumbling before my eyes. But why? I managed to whisper. Why would my mother do something like this? And why Caroline? Inspector Vega leaned in, his voice softening slightly. That's what we're trying to figure out, ma'am. And we need your help. Did you notice anything unusual in your mother's behavior these past months? Any mention of business or financial worries? I closed my eyes, trying to remember. The last few months had been a whirlwind of hospital visits, medications, and anxiety. But then one clear memory surfaced. There was something, I said slowly. A week before she passed, Mom told me she had something important to share. She said someone had approached her with a proposal, but she was afraid she might have made a mistake. She never told me what it was about. I thought it was just the delirium from her medications. I saw the inspectors exchange a knowing glance. Sub-Inspector Torres scribbled a few quick notes. Ma'am Martinez, Mr. Alvarez, said Inspector Vega, his tone growing formal, given the nature of this information and the discrepancies we've found. I'm afraid we'll have to seize the property on Serrano Street as evidence until we can clear up this situation. What? You can't do that, I exclaimed, panic gripping me. It's my home, everything I have left of my mother. James squeezed my hand gently. Lucy, calm down. We'll find a solution. Inspector Vega stood. For now, I ask that you do not leave the city and remain available for further questioning. This investigation is far from over. As we left the interrogation room, my mind swirled with unanswered questions. What secrets had my mother kept? What role did Caroline play in all of this? And most importantly, how was I going to untangle this web of lies and deceit to uncover the truth? One thing was clear, nothing was as it seemed, and the path to the truth would be long and painful. But I was determined to walk it, no matter where it led, for my mother, for myself, and for the justice we both deserved. The weeks following our interrogation were a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. Each day brought a new disclosure, as if we were unraveling an endless skein of lies and secrets. James and I moved through Madrid like shadows, from one law office to another, from one bank to the next, always searching for answers and always finding more questions. One particularly cold January morning, we received a call from Inspector Vega. His voice, tired yet tinged with triumph, took my breath away. "Ma'am Martinez," he said, "I believe we've gotten to the bottom of this. Could you and Mr. Alvarez come to the station this afternoon?" The metro ride to the station was silent. James and I sat side by side, our hands intertwined, each lost in our own thoughts. What awaited us? Would it be good news or more complications? The interrogation room seemed smaller than I remembered. Inspector Vega and Sub-Inspector Torres were already there, their faces serious yet with a glimmer of satisfaction. "Thank you for coming," began Inspector Vega. "We have much to discuss." For the next 2 hours, we listened in astonishment as the inspectors unraveled the tangled web of deceit surrounding my mother's death. It turned out that Caroline, my mother-in-law, had been involved in an elaborate real estate fraud scheme for years. She used her position as a real estate agent to target vulnerable property owners. "Your mother, Ma'am Martinez," explained Sub-Inspector Torres, "was one of her targets. Caroline found out about her illness and saw an opportunity. My mother, desperate to leave me something substantial after her death, had fallen into Caroline's trap. They made her believe that she could multiply the value of the house by entering into a business that turned out to be a sophisticated scam. The multiple wills," continued Inspector Vega, "were part of Caroline's plan. She manipulated your mother into signing documents she didn't fully understand, taking advantage of her failing health." James, sitting beside me, sank further into his chair with each revelation, his face a mask of shame and horror. "And the money?" I asked, recalling the enormous sums that had flowed through my mother's account. Sub-Inspector Torres nodded gravely. "Money laundering. Caroline was using her victims' accounts to move illicit funds. Your mother, unknowingly, became a key part of that operation." My head spun. My sweet, honest mother, unwittingly entangled in something so murky. And Caroline, the woman who was meant to be like a second mother to me, turned out to be the mastermind behind it all. "What will happen now?" James asked in a barely audible voice. Inspector Vega leaned forward. "Caroline Alvarez was arrested this morning. She faces charges of fraud, extortion, and money laundering. As for you," I held my breath, fearing the worst. "The house on Serrano Street will be returned to you, Ma'am Martinez," continued the inspector. "We've recovered your mother's original will, the one naming you as her sole heir. It was hidden in a safety deposit box under Caroline's name." I felt as if a massive weight had been lifted from my shoulders. My mother's home would be mine again. But the relief was quickly tinged with deep sadness for all that had transpired. "There's something else," added Sub-Inspector Torres. "We found a letter from your mother, Ma'am Martinez. It appears she wrote it in her final days when she began to suspect something was wrong." With trembling hands, I accepted the envelope. My mother's shaky, unmistakable handwriting greeted me as I opened it. "My dear Lucy, if you're reading this, it means my worst fears have come true. I made a terrible mistake, blinded by the desire to secure your future. But now I see that I have endangered the one thing that truly matters, our home, our memories. Forgive me, my daughter. Forgive me for not trusting you, for falling for the lies of those who claimed they wanted to help us. And above all, forgive me for not telling you the truth when I had the chance. Always remember that I love you, and that every decision I made, even if it was wrong, was made with you in mind. Be strong, my Lucy. Fight for what is yours, for what is ours. And remember, true wealth isn't found in possessions, but in the memories we share and the love we had. Forever yours." Mom, tears streamed down my cheeks as I finished reading. James wrapped an arm around me, offering silent comfort. Inspector Vega cleared his throat. "Ma'am Martinez, Mr. Alvarez, you are free to go. We will keep you informed about the legal proceedings against Caroline Alvarez." We left the station in silence, the weight of all we had learned still pressing down on us. The late afternoon sun bathed the streets of Madrid in a golden glow that sharply contrasted with the storm of emotions within me. "Lucy," James finally said as we stopped in a small park near our home, "I'm so sorry. I had no idea what my mother was doing. If only I had known." I looked at him, seeing the pain and remorse in his eyes. Part of me wanted to blame him, to shout for him not to have seen what was happening right under his nose. But another part, the part that remembered the man I had fallen in love with, understood that he, too, had been a victim of this deceit. "I know, James," I murmured softly. "I know." We sat on a bench, watching families stroll by and children play, oblivious to the drama we'd just endured. "What will we do now?" James asked, his voice heavy with uncertainty. I thought about Mom's letter, her words of love and regret. I thought about the house on Serrano Street and all the memories it held. And I thought about myself, the woman I'd become through this ordeal. "Now," I said, feeling a new determination swell within me, "we rebuild. We honor my mother's memory, we heal these wounds, and we create a new future, one built on truth and trust." James squeezed my hand gently. "Together," he said, both a question and a promise. I looked at him, seeing the love and remorse in his eyes. I knew we had a long road ahead, that rebuilding trust would take time. But I also knew that the love we once shared was still there, waiting to be rediscovered. Together, I affirmed, feeling as if I stood on the brink of a new beginning. As the sun set over Madrid, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold, I felt a peace I hadn't known in weeks. The journey to the truth had been hard and painful, but it had also freed me. Freed from lies, from manipulation, from the doubts that had tormented me. This was the beginning of my freedom, a freedom won at a high price, but one I would cherish and protect with every fiber of my being. And as James and I walked home hand in hand, I knew that whatever challenges the future held, we would face them with honesty, love, and the strength we had discovered within ourselves. My mother's legacy would live on not only in the house on Serrano Street, but in the lesson she left me, that love, truth, and integrity are the strongest foundations on which to build a life. And that would be my guide as I moved forward into this new chapter, finally free to write my own story.